I met Dylan at my local bookstore. He was in the poetry section, flipping through a book I'd just bought the week before. He caught my eye and smiled, like he'd been waiting to find someone to talk to about it. We struck up a conversation, and before I knew it, we'd been chatting for over an hour. He had this soft confidence, the kind that didn't need to prove itself. When he asked for my number, I gave it to him without a second thought. From the beginning, Dylan seemed like everything I'd ever wanted. He was the kind of guy who'd listen with his full attention, who remembered small details like my favorite tea and the way I liked my books arranged on the shelf. One day, he surprised me by showing up at my door with tickets to a reading by my favorite author. I hadn't even told him I'd wanted to go, but he'd remembered me mentioning the author once in passing. Green flag number one. Thoughtful in a way that felt effortless. As we spent more time together, he brought this lightness into my life. I was always the responsible one, the planner, the one who stayed late at work, but Dylan had this knack for making me feel like life was more than just schedules and goals. He'd take me out for spontaneous drives to the beach, late-night ice cream runs, and small road trips. When I was stressed, he'd insist I close my laptop and come outside with him, saying, "Life is happening right now." I felt freer with him than I ever had before, like I was living out a version of myself I didn't know existed. But around the 6-month mark, things started to change in ways I barely noticed at first. One night, I was going out to meet a friend for dinner, and as I was getting ready, he commented, "I didn't know you liked to get so dressed up for other people." He laughed it off right after, so I brushed it aside, thinking he was just being playful. But then it happened again. A couple of weeks later, he saw a photo from that same night and said, "I didn't realize you looked that good." The comment had this edge to it, like he was telling me I'd crossed some invisible line. Slowly, little things began to add up. He'd get quiet if I didn't respond to his texts right away, and if I took too long, he'd ask if I was losing interest. If I mentioned hanging out with friends, he'd make these little comments about how nice it must be to have time for everyone else. The first time he did it, I explained how important my friends were to me, and he apologized, saying he just missed me and that he didn't mean to make me feel bad. But then it happened again, and again. After a while, I started adjusting my plans without even realizing it. I checked my phone constantly if I was out, making sure I hadn't missed any texts. I'd rush through dinner with friends, feeling like I needed to get home to avoid making him feel neglected. The worst part was that he'd never directly asked me to change my plans. He'd just make these small comments, drop hints that somehow made me feel selfish for wanting time to myself. Then there was the night of my best friend's birthday. It was a big celebration, one she'd been planning for weeks, and I was excited to be there with everyone. But when I told Dylan about it, he got quiet, nodding along, but not really looking at me. "Have fun," he said, but his tone made it clear he wasn't happy. I asked him what was wrong, and he sighed, saying he just hoped we'd spend the weekend together. I felt torn. Part of me wanted to go and celebrate with my friends, but another part felt like I was somehow betraying him. In the end, I made an excuse to leave the party early and went over to his place. He opened the door with this relieved smile, and I tried to convince myself that it was worth it, that I'd done the right thing. But that night, lying next to him, I felt this nagging sense of unease. How had I gone from being excited about a party to feeling guilty for even wanting to go? I pushed the thought aside, telling myself that I'd just misunderstood him. After all, he'd always been so caring, so attentive. I told myself he was just more sensitive than most, that he needed a little extra reassurance. I wanted to be there for him the way he'd been there for me. But as time went on, the little adjustments I made started to feel more like sacrifices. He'd check in on me constantly, asking about every little detail of my day. If I took too long to respond, he'd send another text, asking if everything was okay. When I told him I wanted a night to myself to read or work on a project, he'd sound hurt, asking if he'd done something wrong. I started feeling like every decision I made had to go through him first, like I was navigating some unspoken set of rules I didn't fully understand. Then one afternoon, I ran into an old friend from college. We ended up chatting for a while, catching up on everything we'd missed, and I lost track of time. When I finally checked my phone, there were several texts from Dylan, each one sounding a little more frantic. "Where are you? Are you okay? Did something happen?" When I told him I'd just been talking with a friend, he replied, "You could have at least let me know." That night, He showed up at my apartment, looking tired and stressed. "I can't help but worry about you," he said, running his hands through his hair. "I'm terrified of losing you." He seemed so sincere, so genuinely afraid, that I ended up apologizing for making him worry. But later, as I replayed the conversation in my head, I started feeling like something was off. Why did he need constant reassurance just because I'd seen a friend? Why did he need to know every single thing I was doing? It all came to a head on a weekend trip I'd planned with my sister. We hadn't spent time together in ages, and I was looking forward to a few days of just the two of us. Dylan knew about the trip, but the night before we left, he called, saying he just wanted to hear my voice one last time. I could sense the sadness in his voice, the unspoken request for me to stay, and for a moment, I actually considered canceling. But I went anyway, feeling guilty as we drove off, my phone buzzing with messages from him. By the second day of the trip, I felt like I was on edge, constantly checking my phone. Every time a text from him popped up, my stomach knotted, like I'd done something wrong. My sister finally asked me what was going on, and I tried to brush it off, saying he was just a little clingy. But she looked at me with this worried expression and said, "You know this isn't normal, right? He's not letting you have any space." Hearing it out loud felt like someone had cracked open a truth I'd been avoiding. I started replaying every moment in my mind, the guilt trips, the constant need for updates, the way I'd slowly given up time with friends, family, even just time to myself, all to keep him happy. It wasn't just clinginess. It was control, wrapped in affection and disguised as love. When I got back, I finally told him we needed to talk. At first, he looked devastated, saying he'd do anything to make it right. But when I brought up how his constant checking and made me feel suffocated, he got defensive. "I'm only like this because I love you," he said. "Most girls would kill for a guy who cares as much as I do." That line stuck with me. Love wasn't supposed to feel like this, like a constant weight on my shoulders, like an endless need to manage someone else's emotions. Love was supposed to make life bigger, not smaller. I ended things, but it wasn't easy. He called, texted, even showed up at my work a few times, saying he just wanted to talk things through. But I knew that if I went back, I'd only lose more of myself. Now I find myself looking back, wondering if I missed the red flags hidden in all those early green flags. How do you know when someone's love is about them rather than you? At what point does caring turn into control? And can a relationship that becomes suffocating ever truly breathe again? It started as just a night out to unwind. No big plans, just me and a couple of friends heading to our usual bar. I'd been feeling restless lately, craving something I couldn't quite put into words, something to break up the monotony. And as it turned out, that was the night everything changed. We'd only been there a little while when I noticed him. He was standing near the edge of the bar, watching the crowd with this easy, quiet confidence that made him seem untouchable, like he was just there for his own amusement. I couldn't stop glancing at him. Every time I looked away, I felt this pull to look back, and sure enough, each time he was still looking at me. Finally, he walked over, and with just a simple hi, we dove into conversation. And suddenly, it was like we were the only two people in the room. His energy was magnetic, funny, smart, with a way of making everything around us disappear. It was that perfect blend of excitement and ease, and I felt myself sinking into it, letting go of any reservations. We laughed and talked for what felt like hours, sharing stories and jokes and little details about our lives that made me feel like I'd known him for years. I'd come out that night looking for something fun, maybe just a little adventure, but here I was completely wrapped up in this stranger, caught up in a feeling that was almost familiar. Eventually, he suggested heading somewhere quieter, and without a second thought, I agreed. It felt like the most natural thing in the world. We slipped out of the bar, talking and laughing as we walked down the quiet street to his place. The night air was cool, and everything felt a little surreal, like we were in our own bubble. By the time we reached his apartment, I was all in, swept up in the moment. Inside, things only got more intense. We talked and laughed some more, each word bringing us closer until we couldn't keep our hands off each other. It was one of those nights that felt like pure magic, one you want to bottle up and keep forever. I felt free, wild, like nothing mattered but that moment and the way he looked at me like I was the only person in the world. But then the morning came, with its harsh, sobering light. I woke up beside him, and the excitement from the night before was replaced by a strange sense of emptiness. He was still asleep, and in the quiet, I felt alone in a way I hadn't expected. The thrill of the night had faded, leaving a hollow feeling that caught me off guard. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand why something that had felt so alive only hours before now felt empty. It didn't make sense. I thought this was what I wanted, a night of fun, no strings, no pressure. So why did I feel like something was missing? After a while, I got dressed, grabbed my things, and quietly let myself out. As I stepped into the cool morning air, the weight of the night's excitement seemed to evaporate, leaving me with that hollow ache. Walking down the street, I kept replaying everything in my mind, trying to understand what had changed. I'd been so caught up in the thrill, convinced that it was exactly what I needed, but now it felt like I'd been chasing something I couldn't catch. I spent the rest of the day wrestling with that feeling, trying to shake it off, but it lingered, gnawing at me. I thought about how often I'd told myself that these casual connections were enough, that I didn't need or even want anything serious. But for the first time, I couldn't ignore the truth. That night had felt amazing, yes, but it also felt empty the second it was over. It was like I'd been running in circles, searching for something I was too scared to admit I wanted. A few days later, I ended up talking to a friend about it, hoping she'd understand. She listened, nodded, and finally said, "Maybe you're not looking for freedom anymore. Maybe you're looking for a connection that sticks." Her words hit hard. I'd spent so long thinking that freedom meant casual flings, nights that didn't go beyond the sunrise. But maybe true freedom was letting myself admit what I actually wanted. Something real, something lasting. Since then, I've been more honest with myself. I still love adventure, still get excited by the possibility of meeting someone new. But I'm starting to see that maybe I want more than just a few hours of magic that disappears with the dawn. I want something that lasts, something that doesn't leave me feeling like I'm right back where I started, searching for something more. That night didn't just give me a fun memory. It gave me a kind of clarity I hadn't expected. It made me see that sometimes what we think we want isn't what we need. I'd been using these wild nights as a way to ignore what I really wanted. But now, I'm done pretending that they're enough. I want a connection that doesn't fade with the morning light, something that doesn't feel like a temporary high. So, here I am, ready to let go of what no longer serves me and embrace what I truly want. I'm still open to the thrill of the unknown, but I'm also open to the possibility of something real. I think, in the end, that's the real freedom, knowing what you want and not settling for anything less. And for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm on the right path, like I'm finally ready for something that lasts. I'm matched with a woman who seemed, in a word, perfect. Her profile wasn't filled with cliches. Instead, she had these sharp, witty captions and photos of herself doing genuinely cool things. Backpacking in the Rockies, scuba diving, and a picture of her holding a massive stack of books she said she'd read that year. We started messaging and hit it off right away. She was funny, smart, and a bit sarcastic, which kept me on my toes. We decided to meet at this trendy bar that was a little hard to get into. She made the reservation, so right away I was thinking, all right, she's organized, she's thoughtful, this might be something special. When I got there, she was already seated, sipping a cocktail, and waved me over with a huge grin. She was even more stunning in person, and I could feel the butterflies kicking in. We ordered drinks, and she immediately jumped into a story about her last trip to Peru, where she hiked a remote trail and ended up spending the night in a stranger's house after her guide got sick. It was one of those stories where you hang on every word, totally drawn in, and she told it like she was a natural-born storyteller. I was captivated. Then she looked at me, gave a little smirk, and said, "So, have you ever had your fortune told?" I shrugged and admitted I hadn't, thinking maybe she was about to share a funny palm reading experience. She laughed and said, "Let's do it." Before I could answer, she was waving over a guy sitting alone at the end of the bar. Apparently, he was her friend, and as it turned out, a professional tarot card reader. I was a little thrown off, but decided to play along. Why not? It was a new experience, and she seemed excited about it. The tarot guy shuffled his cards, giving me this intense, knowing look as he started laying them out in a careful pattern. My date was leaning in, fully engaged, watching the cards with bated breath. He flipped the first one, looked at me, and said in this low, dramatic voice, "You're about to go through a profound transformation." I tried not to laugh because he was so serious, but my date gasped, her eyes wide, whispering, "I knew it." The tarot reader continued, explaining how I was at a crossroads and that I'd soon face life-altering choices. Meanwhile, my date was nodding along like he was revealing the secrets of the universe. I went along with it, nodding and murmuring agreement. But then the reader flipped over a card and suddenly got quiet. He looked at me, then at her, and back at me with this grave expression and said, "You two share a powerful karmic bond. Your souls have met before, perhaps in another lifetime." My date's eyes were locked onto mine, unblinking. I felt a weird pressure building, like I was expected to say something equally profound. But I just kind of laughed it off, saying, "Well, I guess we're off to a strong start." She didn't laugh. Instead, she looked dead serious and said, "I felt at the moment we matched. I froze." She went on, explaining that she believed we'd been drawn together by fate, and that meeting me felt bigger than coincidence. It was clear she wasn't joking. She actually believed this was some kind of destined reunion. I felt a bead of sweat start to form on my forehead as I nodded along, trying to keep things light, but she was staring at me with this intense gaze like she was seeing through my soul. After the tarot reading, things only got weirder. She started asking me deeply personal questions, like where I thought I'd been in my past lives and if I felt a spiritual connection to any specific historical era. She asked if I'd ever had visions, and kept referencing how important it was for spiritual partners to support each other through reincarnation cycles. She mentioned something about how she'd always had visions of herself as a healer and thought that maybe, in a past life, she'd been a shaman in the mountains. At this point, I was ready to wrap things up, but she insisted we go to a park nearby for grounding. She explained that if we walked barefoot on the grass under the full moon, which happened to be that night, it would bind our energies. I was torn between my curiosity and the strange feeling that I might be getting inducted into a spiritual covenant without even realizing it. Against my better judgment, I agreed, hoping this would be a quirky story I'd laugh about later. We got to the park, and she kicked off her shoes, looking at me expectantly. So I did the same, standing there in the grass, feeling increasingly ridiculous. She reached for my hand, closed her eyes, and started humming. I stood there, feeling the cool grass under my feet, but mostly just hoping no one I knew would walk by. After a few minutes of this, she looked up at me, eyes shining, and said, "Do you feel it? Our energies aligning?" I mumbled something about feeling very connected, and she beamed like I'd just declared my eternal devotion. When I finally made my excuses and left, she gave me this long, lingering hug and whispered, "I know we're meant to do great things together." I smiled, thanked her for the night, and all but ran to my car. On the drive home, I felt like I'd just survived an initiation ceremony for a spiritual bond one hadn't signed up for. A text came through later saying, "Can't wait to see you again and continue our journey." I never responded, realizing I wasn't quite ready to be someone's destined soulmate through cycles of reincarnation. That night taught me that some people are looking for a connection that's, well, cosmic. And sometimes, all you really want is a second date where your feet stay in your shoe. I met Emily at a wedding. It was one of those beautiful, golden-lit evenings, and we found ourselves standing next to each other at the bar, laughing over the terrible DJ choice. She was magnetic, sharp, funny, and had this way of making me feel like I was the only person in the room. She was quick with compliments and asked me questions that were so thoughtful and specific, it was like she'd known me forever. By the end of the night, we were inseparable, trading stories and looking at each other like we both just won the lottery. The relationship swept me up like nothing I'd ever experienced. She was always surprising me, finding creative, elaborate ways to show she cared. She'd show up at my place with homemade dinners after a rough day, send me long, heartfelt texts, and even planned this amazing weekend getaway just a month into dating. Friends would tell me how lucky I was, how perfect we seemed together, and I believed it. She made me feel seen and cherished in a way I hadn't felt before. It was intense, but it felt real, like this was finally it. But not long after, I noticed her moods would swing dramatically, almost out of nowhere. One night, we'd be cuddling on the couch, and she'd talk about how she'd never felt this close to anyone. But the next, she'd pull back, suddenly cold and distant, and I'd have no idea why. She'd tell me that she just needed space, or that she was feeling overwhelmed. But when I tried to give her space, she'd say things like, "I thought you cared more than that," or "I feel like you're just leaving me alone when I need you." It started to feel like I was walking a tightrope, never sure what version of her I was going to get or what small action of mine would push her away. If I went out with friends, she'd sulk or hint that she'd rather I spent time with her instead. If I didn't answer her text fast enough, she'd say things like, "I guess I'm not a priority." And when I tried to explain, she'd dismiss me, saying I just didn't understand her needs. Somehow, in every argument, she'd find a way to make me feel like I was in the wrong. One weekend, she insisted on meeting my family, even though I told her I wasn't ready to introduce her yet. She'd say, "If you really saw a future with me, this wouldn't be such a big deal." I felt cornered, but I didn't want her to feel unwanted, so I brought her along. She was charming, winning over everyone in a way that made me feel like I'd made the right choice. But later that night, when she noticed me laughing with my sister, she went quiet and withdrew. When we got home, she accused me of excluding her, saying she felt like I wasn't making her a real part of my life. I was stunned, caught between the memory of how she'd seemed so happy that day and the bitterness in her voice now. These accusations started happening more often. Little things, my family, my friends, my hobbies became sources of tension. She'd say things like, "You're so different with them," or "Sometimes I feel like you don't even need me." The longer we were together, the more she'd find ways to isolate me from anyone who wasn't her. If I planned a night out, she'd make me feel guilty for leaving her behind, questioning why I'd want to be with other people when we could be together. Soon, I found myself canceling plans, staying home with her, telling myself that I was being a good partner, that maybe I was too focused on my social life. I started drifting away from people who'd once been close, believing that I was just prioritizing the relationship. There were times when she'd get especially moody or withdrawn, and no matter what I did, it wasn't enough. She'd go silent, her face a mask, and when I'd ask if everything was okay, she'd sigh and say, "If you don't know by now, maybe you never will." I'd find myself apologizing without even knowing what I was apologizing for, trying to smooth things over without understanding what I'd done wrong. Every time, she'd eventually forgive me, telling me she just needed me to try harder or be more attentive. I started questioning everything I did, wondering if maybe I really was neglecting her or if I just didn't know how to be a good boyfriend. But the real breaking point came after she went through my phone. I'd left it on the counter one morning, and when I came back, she was scrolling through my messages. I remember freezing, feeling this cold dread spread through me. When I asked her what she was doing, she looked up and said, "I just wanted to make sure there was nothing you were hiding from me." She said it so calmly, like it was the most normal thing in the world. She found an old message from a friend of mine, someone I'd known for years, and twisted it into something it wasn't, accusing me of hiding things, of being emotionally dishonest. I tried to explain, but she wouldn't listen. She said things like, "I thought I could trust you, but clearly I was wrong, and maybe I just care more about us than you do." I spent the entire day defending myself, explaining things I shouldn't have had to explain, trying to calm her down. By the end of it, I felt drained, empty. I went to bed that night wondering how we'd gone from that amazing first month to this, wondering how much of myself I'd lost trying to keep her happy. Over the next few weeks, I started researching toxic relationships, reading about control and manipulation, and every article felt like someone had followed us around with a camera. The more I read, the more I realized that what I thought was love was actually something else entirely. It wasn't care, it was control. It wasn't support, it was manipulation. When I finally confronted her about it, she broke down crying, telling me she was just afraid of losing me, that she only acted that way because she loved me so much. She apologized, said she'd try to change, that things would be different. But by then, I knew too much. I could see the pattern, how I'd lost myself in her needs, how I'd slowly become isolated from my friends, my family, my own life. I'd spent so much time trying to be what she wanted that I'd forgotten who I was. Leaving her was one of the hardest things I've ever done. She pleaded, saying she'd change, that she couldn't imagine life without me. But I knew if I stayed, I'd just keep losing myself bit by bit, drowning under the weight of her expectations and my own guilt. So, I left. It's been a struggle since then. There are days when I miss the person I thought she was, the person she'd been in those early days. And there are days when I feel a pang of guilt, wondering if I could have done more, if maybe I'd been too harsh. But I'm also slowly finding myself again, reaching back out to the friends I pushed away, rediscovering the parts of my life I'd let go of for her. So, Reddit, for those who've been in toxic relationships, how did you let go of the guilt? How did you find the courage to put yourself first again? I'd really appreciate any advice or encouragement from people who've been. I think I always knew it would end like this, quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a candle burning out. But the moment it truly ended for me was on an ordinary Wednesday night, right after dinner. She was washing the dishes, and I was standing there drying them, just like we'd done 100 times. She was telling me about her day, something funny that happened with her coworkers, and I was smiling and nodding along, but inside I was screaming. Because as she talked, I realized I couldn't remember the last time we'd genuinely laughed together or felt that warmth that used to be so effortless between us. When she finished her story, she looked up at me, waiting for a reaction, a laugh, anything, and all I could manage was a forced smile. She looked disappointed, but she didn't say anything. She just went back to the dishes. It was in that moment, standing side by side, that I realized we weren't partners anymore. We were just people sharing a space, going through the motions. We'd been together 8 years, and there was a time when she was my whole world. We met at a mutual friend's birthday party. She was standing by the bar, laughing this huge, infectious laugh, and I couldn't take my eyes off her. There was this light around her, this undeniable energy. She spotted me watching her, and instead of looking away, she walked right over, held out her hand, and said, "I'm stealing you for the dance floor." And just like that, she pulled me into her orbit. The first few years together were incredible. We'd stay up until sunrise talking, share every little detail of our day, cook meals together, take spontaneous road trips. She was the kind of person who made everything feel new and exciting. Our lives blended so easily, so naturally. When we moved in together, it felt like the most natural step in the world. I thought we'd found something unbreakable. But somewhere along the way, things shifted. At first, it was little things. She started working late more often, coming home tired, barely speaking before heading to bed. I'd try to ask about her day, try to share mine, but our conversations grew shorter, less intimate. It was like every day added another layer of silence between us. I told myself it was just a phase, that we were both busy, that once things settled down, we'd go back to how we were. I started trying to plan things, to create moments that would pull us back together. I booked a weekend getaway to the mountains, hoping the change of scenery would spark something. For a while, it felt like it worked. We spent one perfect evening by the fire, wrapped in blankets, talking like we used to. I could see glimpses of the girl I'd fallen in love with, and I let myself believe we were on the right track. But as soon as we got back home, it was like the connection we'd found evaporated, and we fell right back into the same quiet distance. After that, I suggested counseling, hoping that maybe if we just tried a little harder, we could fix it. She agreed, but I could see the hesitation in her eyes. Every session felt like pulling teeth. I'd pour my heart out, confessing my fears, my hopes, my regrets, but her responses were always short, guarded. She'd sit there, nodding politely, saying all the right things, but her heart wasn't in it. I realized that while I was fighting to save us, she was already halfway out the door. One night, after another session where I'd done most of the talking, I asked her if she even wanted to try anymore. She paused, looked down, and whispered, "I don't know." That was the moment it hit me. The woman I loved was already gone, and I'd been holding on to a version of her that didn't exist anymore. After that, everything moved quickly. We both knew it was over, but we were too exhausted to fight about it. We sat down one night and talked about logistics, who would take what, how we'd handle telling our families. There were no raised voices, no angry words. Just a quiet, painful acceptance that we'd reached the end. She packed up her things over the course of a week, taking little bits of our life with her. Every time I came home, the apartment felt a little emptier, a little more hollow. The day she left, I stood by the door as she carried out the last of her boxes. She gave me a small, sad smile, and for a second, I thought about pulling her into a hug, holding her one last time. But we both knew it would only make things harder. She turned, walked down the hall, and just like that, she was gone. The silence that followed was unbearable. I never realized how much of my life had been filled by her presence, even in those quiet moments. Now, the emptiness of the apartment was deafening. I'd catch myself turning to share something with her, only to remember she wasn't there. I found myself avoiding the places we used to go, even skipping the coffee shop where we'd spent so many mornings talking over cappuccinos. Friends tried to help, inviting me out, keeping me busy, but there was a part of me that didn't want to move on, that didn't want to let go of the life we'd built together. I spent hours scrolling through old photos, rereading texts, replaying memories. It was like I was searching for some explanation, some sign that would tell me where we'd gone wrong. One night, I found myself sitting on the floor, surrounded by things she'd left behind. A sweater she'd forgotten, an old book of poetry she used to read. I picked up the book, flipped through the pages, and found a note she'd written in the margins. Love doesn't die. It just changes. I read those words over and over, feeling a strange sense of peace and sadness wash over me. I knew I had to start letting go, to find a way forward without her. I started going for long walks, rediscovering the city on my own. I joined a local volunteer group, something I'd always wanted to do, but never found the time for. I picked up a new hobby, painting, even though I was terrible at it. It was something to fill the empty hours, something to remind myself that life could still have color. Slowly, I began to rebuild. The days got a little easier, the nights a little less lonely. I still think about her, still miss her laugh, her presence, the way she'd make even the simplest moments feel special. But I'm learning to carry those memories with me without letting them weigh me down. Some days, it still hurts, that hollow ache of a life I'll never get back. But I'm finding pieces of myself that I'd forgotten about, parts of me that got lost somewhere in our years together. And maybe that's the silver lining, rediscovering who I am without her, learning to stand on my own again. So for anyone who's been through this, how did you let go? How did you find yourself after losing someone who was your entire world? Because I'm trying, and I'm getting there, but some days it still feels like there's a long way to go. I met Adam at a holiday party. I'd been dragged there by my best friend, feeling out of place among strangers, sipping cheap wine just to ease my nerves. But then, out of nowhere, he was standing in front of me, flashing this warm, easy smile. He asked how I'd ended up there, and before I knew it, we were talking like old friends. He was magnetic, confident, charming, and funny, with this way of making me feel like the only person in the room. When he asked for my number, I gave it to him without hesitation, feeling giddy and, for the first time in a long time, truly seen. Things with Adam moved quickly. By our third date, he was telling me how special I was, how he'd never met anyone like me. He'd talk about our future, painting this picture of us living together in a cozy apartment, adopting a dog, and traveling the world. It felt like a whirlwind, but he was so sincere, so absolutely sure of us, that I started to believe in his vision too. He was thoughtful, sending me little notes throughout the day and dropping by my office with coffee just because he couldn't wait to see me. I remember thinking, this is it. I found my person. In the beginning, everything seemed perfect. Adam made me feel loved and adored in a way I'd never experienced before. I was used to being the one who gave too much, who cared too much, but with him, it felt mutual. Friends started joking about how lucky I was, how Adam was the ideal boyfriend, and I agreed. Every little thing he did seemed like proof of how deeply he cared for me. But after a while, things started to shift. I remember the first time I felt that small knot of doubt. I'd planned a dinner with a few old friends from college, and Adam suggested that I invite him along. I thought it was a little strange since he didn't know them and it was one of our few catch-ups, but I figured it'd be fine. The dinner itself went well, or so I thought, but as soon as we left, he grew quiet. When I asked if he was okay, He just looked at me, hurt, and said, "I felt so out of place there, like you didn't even care if I was around." I was taken aback, but he was so sincere, so vulnerable, that I found myself apologizing, promising to make it up to him. That was just the start. Gradually, Adam began slipping little comments into our conversations, almost like they were throwaway lines, but they'd stick with me. If I mentioned wanting to go out with friends, he'd say things like, "You have so many friends, I feel like I barely see you." Or, "Sometimes I think you'd rather be with them than with me." It didn't feel like he was trying to control me. It felt more like he was afraid of losing me, like he needed constant reassurance. I started rescheduling plans with friends, choosing quieter nights in with Adam to show him that he was my priority. But his insecurities never really went away. One night, I was texting my brother, laughing at a funny story he'd shared. Adam glanced over and saw me smiling, and his face immediately darkened. He asked who I was texting, his tone flat but loaded. I told him it was my brother, but he stayed quiet, just watching me with that hurt look I was beginning to know too well. "It's like I'm not enough for you," he finally said, almost in a whisper. The guilt twisted inside me, and I felt compelled to put my phone away and reassure him. I told myself he was just sensitive, that he loved me so much he couldn't bear the idea of being left out. His comments started creeping into every part of my life. He'd question why I needed so much time with family, ask if I really had to go to social events, make it clear that my work hours were cutting into our time. Each time, he'd say it in that same soft, hurt tone, like he was just disappointed, like he only wanted to feel closer to me. It was so subtle, so disguised as affection, that I didn't see it for what it was. I found myself drifting away from my friends and family, pulling back from things I'd once loved, feeling like maybe I was the one who was overcommitted or unavailable. Then came the criticisms. They always came as suggestions, things he thought might help me. He'd comment on my clothes, suggesting that some outfits were too attention-seeking or not really my style. When I told him about a new project at work, something I was really excited about, he'd sigh and say, "That sounds stressful. Are you sure you want to take that on?" It was like he was chipping away at everything that made me feel good, but it was always in this concerned, supportive way that made me feel like he was looking out for me. I thought maybe he saw things in me I couldn't see, that he was helping me be a better version of myself. But the isolation crept up on me slowly, like a fog I didn't realize I was stepping into. My friends started drifting away, tired of my canceled plans, my constant excuses. Family gatherings became rare, with Adam saying he just didn't feel comfortable at them, like he was an outsider. I felt this growing distance from everyone, like I was in a world where Adam was the only constant, the only one who truly understood me. And I let it happen because I thought that was what love was, putting someone else first, being there for them no matter what. The final straw was a family emergency. My dad had a health scare, and I needed to be with him. When I told Adam, he looked pained and said, "I understand. I just wish you'd let me be your family too." The words cut me to the bone. I wanted to scream, to tell him that this was my father, that of course I had to be there. But instead, I found myself trying to comfort him, apologizing for leaving him out, trying to promise that it was just temporary. I hated myself in that moment, hated how I'd twisted myself into knots trying to keep him happy, even as my world was falling apart. Sitting in the hospital waiting room that night, I looked at my phone, at the countless missed calls and texts from Adam. Each one felt like a weight pressing down on me, a reminder of how much of myself I'd given up just to keep him from feeling alone. I realized that in trying to be everything he needed, I'd left myself with nothing. I was lonely, exhausted, a shell of the person I used to be. The moment I returned, Adam was waiting in my apartment, demanding to know why I'd been gone so long, why I hadn't been checking in. He accused me of abandoning him, of not caring about his feelings, as though his neediness was somehow more important than my family's crisis. I looked at him, and for the first time, I saw the truth, that his love wasn't love at all. It was a leash, a way to keep me close, to make me feel like his needs were the only ones that mattered. I told him it was over. He begged, promised he'd change, that he'd do better. But I knew, finally, that nothing would change, that his love came with conditions that would only suffocate me further. Leaving him felt like breaking free, like finally coming up for air after years of slowly drowning. Now, I'm trying to piece myself back together, to remember who I was before Adam made me believe I had to be someone else to be worthy of love. I'm reaching out to friends and family, apologizing for the times I left them behind. But the hardest part is learning to trust myself again, to believe that I'm enough on my own. To anyone who's been through something like this, I'd love to hear your stories. How did you reclaim your life after someone chipped away at it, bit by bit? How do you rebuild after realizing the love you trusted was only ever a cage? Ethan and I had been together for 3 years, and I thought we were solid. We met in college and had one of those slow-burn romances that started as a close friendship blossoming over time. He was my person, the one I'd call in the middle of the night with a random thought, the one I could sit in silence with, just enjoying his presence. It wasn't always perfect, but it felt real, like we were building something lasting. We'd talk about our dreams, our goals, even our fears, and it always felt like we were on the same page, like we had a shared future ahead of us. But a few months ago, Ethan started pulling back, little by little. It was almost imperceptible at first, a missed date here, a distracted answer there. I chalked it up to his new job, which had him working late nights and handling stressful projects. He'd come home exhausted, and I'd do my best to make things easier for him, making dinner or keeping the conversation light, so he could unwind. I told myself that things would settle down once he got the hang of his new routine. But the distance only grew. He started avoiding eye contact, barely acknowledged me when I asked about his day, and our easy conversations became strained, awkward even. I'd ask him what was wrong, and he'd shrug, saying it was just work stuff. He'd wave off my concerns, insisting he was fine, that everything was fine. But everything wasn't fine. It was like he'd become a ghost in our own home, slipping into silence as soon as he walked through the door. I found myself tiptoeing around him, afraid to ask too much, to say the wrong thing, worried that I'd somehow push him further away. And then there was his phone. It's cliche, I know, but he used to leave his phone out on the counter, unlocked, sometimes even asking me to check a text if he was busy. But now it was always in his hand, face down, the notifications muted. If it buzzed, he'd glance at it quickly and shove it into his pocket, giving me that quick, it's-nothing smile that felt emptier each time. I tried not to overthink it, tried not to let my mind wander into worst-case scenarios. But it gnawed at me, this feeling that he was hiding something, that the man I knew so well was slipping away. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something he wasn't telling me. I'd lie awake at night, going over every detail, every small change, wondering if it was me, if I'd done something to push him away without even realizing it. After weeks of agonizing over it, I couldn't keep silent anymore. One night, after another dinner filled with forced smiles and long silences, I gathered the courage to bring it up. I looked across the table at him, my heart racing as I finally asked the question that had been haunting me. "Ethan," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper, "is everything okay? With us?" He looked up surprised, like he hadn't expected me to notice. "Yeah, of course. Just work's been a lot. I know work's been hard, but you've been so distant lately. It feels like I'm losing you." I paused, swallowing the lump in my throat. "If there's something bothering you, something I don't know, please just tell me." He let out a sigh, rubbing his temples like he was already tired of the conversation. "I don't know what you want me to say. I told you I'm just stressed." "But that's not it, is it?" I pressed, unable to hold back the flood of emotions anymore. "I'm here, Ethan. I'm right here, trying to reach you, and it feels like you're somewhere else." He went silent, his eyes dropping to his plate. I felt a chill run through me, the kind you get when you're bracing yourself for bad news. I could feel my heart pounding, waiting, hoping for something, anything, that would reassure me. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he looked up, his expression a mixture of sadness and something else I couldn't place. I don't know if I'm happy anymore," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I could barely breathe, the room spinning around me as I tried to process what he was saying. "Not happy with what? With us?" He nodded slowly, and the silence that followed felt like it would swallow me whole. "I don't know how to explain it," he said finally. "It's like something's missing, and I don't know what it is. But I feel empty. And it's not your fault. Not my fault. The words felt hollow, meaningless. How could it not be my fault when he was sitting here, telling me he didn't know if he was happy with me anymore? I wanted to scream, to cry, to shake him and demand answers, but instead, I just sat there numb. Why didn't you tell me? I asked, my voice breaking. Why did you shut me out instead of talking to me about it? He looked away, unable to meet my eyes. I didn't know how to bring it up. I didn't want to hurt you. Hurt me? I laughed, though there was no humor in it. Do you know how much worse it is to watch you pull away, to feel like I'm losing you and not even know why? He ran his hands through his hair, frustration flashing in his eyes. I don't know what you want me to say. I've been trying to figure it out, trying to understand what's wrong, but I don't have an answer. I felt my chest tighten, a desperate plea rising to my lips. Ethan, if something's broken, we can fix it, but I can't fix something I don't even know is wrong. Please, if you still care about me, about us, let me in. He stayed silent, his jaw clenched, and in that moment I knew he was already gone. Whatever he was feeling, whatever emptiness he was wrestling with, he'd made up his mind. And the worst part was, I had no idea how long he'd been feeling this way, how long he'd been pretending. We sat there in silence, both of us too afraid to say the words that would make it real. Finally, he got up, grabbing his jacket, muttering something about needing air. And just like that, he walked out, leaving me alone in the empty room with nothing but my shattered heart and the echoes of everything we used to be. The days after that conversation were a blur. He came home occasionally, but the distance between us had only grown. We'd tiptoe around each other, pretending everything was fine when it was anything but. I kept hoping he'd change his mind, that he'd walk through the door one day and tell me he'd made a mistake, that he wanted to make things work. But that day never came. Now I'm left with memories of what we used to have, wondering if any of it was real. Was he happy once, or had I just imagined it? Had he always been searching for something I couldn't give him? I keep asking myself what went wrong, replaying every conversation, every moment, searching for answers that never come. How do you let go of someone who's already let go of you? How do you move on when the person you thought was your forever turns into a stranger? I don't have any answers. All I have are questions and a broken heart that doesn't know how to heal. Is it possible to rebuild your life when the foundation crumbles beneath you? Has anyone else gone through this and come out stronger on the other side? Because right now, I don't know how to move forward when everything I thought I knew feels like it was a lie. Last year, in late spring, I went to my best friend Eric's family reunion, held at their sprawling old farmhouse just outside the city. Eric and I had known each other since middle school, and though we had drifted apart during college, we reconnected after graduation. He called one day, insisting I come to the reunion, describing it as a legendary weekend of grilling, chilling, and a whole lot of beer. I arrived on Friday evening, and Eric introduced me around to his extended family. The yard was already buzzing with laughter and music, and the smell of barbecue drifted through the warm evening air. Eric's mom, Anna, was there too, catching up with relatives and waving at me across the yard. I remembered her as the fun, slightly eccentric mom who always had a snack ready and a joke to share. But now, seeing her again, I noticed something I hadn't before. She looked stunning, relaxed in a way that made her almost glow. Later that night, as the crowd thinned, Anna and I found ourselves alone by the fire pit. Eric had gone off somewhere, and Anna and I sat in the quiet, both of us nursing a drink. She smiled at me warmly, saying, "I'm glad Eric dragged you here. I know he's been missing your friendship." Her eyes had a warmth and a kindness that made me feel completely at ease. "It's good to be back here," I replied. "It feels like I never left." I looked around at the house, the yard, everything that was so familiar and comforting. "Thanks for always treating me like family." She gave a soft laugh, the firelight flickering in her eyes. "Well, you practically are family. I've watched you grow up." There was a long pause after she said this, and I felt something in the air shift. She was looking at me in a way that didn't feel like the mom I remembered. Her eyes lingered a little longer, her expression unreadable but intense. As the fire crackled between us, she asked how life had been treating me since I moved to the city. I told her about my job, the usual ups and downs, and how hard it was adjusting. She listened intently, nodding as if she understood every word. At some point, our conversation took a turn, and she started telling me about her own life since her divorce a few years back. She was honest in a way I hadn't expected, vulnerable even, admitting how she'd struggled with loneliness and finding a sense of purpose after the kids left home. "I spent so much of my life taking care of other people," she said softly, her gaze fixed on the flames. "It's strange when you find yourself alone, with no one else to take care of but yourself." I didn't know what to say. There was a sadness in her words that pulled at something deep in me. Before I realized it, I reached out, placing my hand on hers, a small, gentle gesture of comfort. She looked down, surprised, but didn't pull away. Instead, she looked up at me, her eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't quite place. For a moment, everything around us faded. The music, the chatter, the laughter, and all I could see was her, looking at me with a mix of surprise and something more. Without thinking, I leaned in, brushing my lips softly against hers, half expecting her to pull back. But she didn't. Instead, she kissed me back, her hand reaching up to touch my face, her touch gentle but sure. It was a kiss filled with a quiet intensity, a connection I hadn't known I needed until that very moment. When we pulled apart, there was a mixture of shock and understanding in her eyes, as if she too had felt something she hadn't expected. "We probably shouldn't," she whispered, but her hand lingered on my cheek, her thumb brushing lightly against my skin. "I know," I replied, my voice barely audible, "but I don't regret it." She gave me a small, sad smile, and we sat there in silence, the weight of what had just happened settling between us. Eventually, we said goodnight, each retreating to our rooms, the memory of that kiss lingering in the air like the fading smoke from the fire. The next day was surreal. We acted like nothing had happened, going through the motions of the reunion, smiling and laughing with everyone else. But every now and then, I'd catch her looking at me, a quiet understanding passing between us. It was as if we shared a secret, something precious and fragile that we both knew couldn't last. On Sunday, after most of the relatives had left, Eric asked me to stay and help clean up. He was called away on a quick errand, leaving me alone with Anna once more. She was in the kitchen, washing dishes, and I walked in, feeling my heart race as I stood beside her, drying the plate she handed me. She looked at me, her expression unreadable, and finally broke the silence. "Last night, that can't happen again," she said, her voice gentle but firm. I nodded, feeling a pang of regret, but knowing she was right. "I understand." She sighed, setting down the dish she'd been holding, and turned to face me fully. "It's just we're from two different worlds, you and I. And Eric, if he ever found out," she trailed off, a sad smile tugging at her lips. "It's just too complicated." I didn't argue. There was nothing to say. Instead, I simply reached out and took her hand, giving it a small squeeze. "I'm glad it happened, though," I said quietly, even if it was just for a moment. She squeezed my hand back, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Me too," she whispered, her voice filled with a tenderness that broke my heart a little. "You're a good man. I hope you know that." We stood there, hands clasped, both knowing this was goodbye. Eventually, she let go, giving me one last, lingering look before turning back to the sink. I took a deep breath, stepping back, feeling the finality of the moment settle in my chest. I left that afternoon, saying goodbye to Eric and his family, hugging Anna one last time, her embrace warm and lingering, as if she too was struggling to let go. I didn't look back as I drove away, but I could still feel her presence, the memory of her touch, her kiss, etched into my mind. Over the following months, life moved on. I threw myself into my work, dated a little, tried to live my life. But no matter what, I couldn't shake the memory of that night by the fire, of the way she looked at me as if she'd found something she'd been searching for. It was a memory that haunted me, a beautiful, bittersweet reminder of a connection that felt both impossible and inevitable. Eventually, I heard through Eric that Anna had moved to a new town, found a new job, and was dating someone. I was happy for her, truly, but there was a pang of something else, a quiet ache that lingered, a feeling I couldn't quite shake. Years later, At another family gathering, I saw her again, briefly. We didn't speak beyond a polite greeting, both of us surrounded by people, laughter, and life. But in that brief moment, our eyes met, and I saw the flicker of a shared memory in her gaze, a secret we both carried, a love that existed only in the quiet spaces of our minds. It was a love that couldn't last, a story that would never be told, but it was ours, and that was enough. It was a cold evening in early winter, the kind of night where you'd usually want to be wrapped up with someone, sharing a meal, or talking about your day. But there we were, sitting in our living room, both of us on opposite ends of the couch, staring at our phones. I kept glancing over at him, waiting for him to look up, to say something that would crack through the quiet. He never did. Eventually, I gave up, pretending to be interested in my phone, even though I'd been scrolling through the same post for an hour. And suddenly, it hit me. I felt more alone next to him than I ever did by myself. I kept replaying that moment over and over in the days that followed, feeling like something had shifted that I couldn't ignore. I used to think we'd grow old together, that he was the person who knew me better than anyone. But now, it felt like we were strangers who just happened to live under the same roof. And it wasn't like something dramatic had happened. No betrayal, no big fight. It was this slow, creeping feeling that we both let go somewhere along the way. At first, I tried to push it down, ignore the feeling, convince myself that it was just a rough patch. But every day, the silence between us felt heavier. I'd find myself looking forward to work or running errands, anything that would get me out of the house. I stopped asking him about his day, because the answer was always the same, fine. I stopped suggesting we watch a movie together, because he'd usually just fall asleep halfway through. I stopped trying to talk about things that mattered to me, because when I did, I could feel his attention drifting. One Saturday, I thought maybe all we needed was some time together, something different. I suggested we go for a drive, maybe take a short hike like we used to. I could see him hesitating, his mouth opening to give me some excuse, but he nodded. So we got in the car, the silence stretching between us as I drove. We eventually parked by a trail, and as we walked, I realized that we hadn't spoken the entire drive over. It felt forced, awkward, like we were on a first date with someone we didn't really want to be with. At one point, he stopped to tie his shoe, and I walked a little ahead, pretending to take in the view. But I wasn't looking at the scenery. I was blinking back tears, feeling this weight in my chest as I realized that we'd lost something we couldn't get back. When he caught up, he gave me a small, distracted smile, like he didn't even notice the sadness on my face. And that hurt more than anything. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay there in the dark, listening to his breathing beside me, my mind racing with all the things I wanted to say but couldn't. I thought about the nights we used to stay up talking, the mornings when he'd make coffee just the way I liked it, the way he'd reach for my hand when we walked together. But those moments felt like they belonged to someone else, like I was watching someone else's memories. I wanted to shake him awake, ask him where he'd gone, or maybe where I'd gone, but I was too afraid of his answer. After a few more days of walking around in this emotional fog, I finally gathered the courage to bring it up. One evening after dinner, I put my fork down, looked across the table, and just asked, "Are you happy with us?" The question came out quieter than I'd meant, but it was like it had been waiting to be said for a long time. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he sighed and leaned back in his chair, looking anywhere but at me. Eventually, he said, "I don't know. I've been wondering the same thing." Hearing him say it felt like my heart was shattering. Part of me had been holding on to this hope that maybe I was just imagining things, that maybe he'd reassure me, tell me I was wrong. But he felt it too. We both knew it, but we'd both been too scared to say it. For the next hour, we sat there and talked about everything. How we'd slowly drifted, how the spark that used to make us feel alive together had faded into something routine and empty. He admitted that he'd been unhappy for a while, but didn't know how to bring it up without hurting me. And I admitted that I'd been holding on to memories, hoping they'd be enough to make us feel like us again. There were no accusations, no anger, just this painful realization that we'd both let things slip, both stopped putting in the effort. Somewhere along the way, we'd gone from being each other's best friends to becoming strangers who shared a life out of habit. And as much as it hurt, we both knew that we couldn't keep pretending anymore. The next few days were surreal. We started separating our things, talking about who would keep the apartment and who would move out. There were moments when I'd feel a wave of sadness so intense that it would knock the breath out of me. Packing up felt like tearing down the life we'd built together, piece by piece. I'd find little reminders of him everywhere. An old birthday card he'd written, a shirt he always left hanging on the closet door, a half-empty bottle of his cologne. I'd hold on to each item a little too long, feeling the ache of knowing it was all coming to an end. The first night after he left, the apartment felt too quiet, too big, like I was the only person in the world. I sat in the middle of the living room, surrounded by empty spaces where his things used to be, feeling both the weight of loss and the faintest whisper of relief. I missed him deeply, but I also knew that something in me was coming back to life. It was like I'd been holding my breath for so long, and now, finally, I could exhale. The days that followed were a strange mix of emotions. There were moments when I'd catch myself reaching for my phone to tell him something funny, only to remember that he wasn't there. I'd go grocery shopping and find myself buying the things he liked, then putting them back on the shelf. Every part of my routine felt off, like I was trying to adjust to a new life that I hadn't asked for. Slowly, though, I started finding pieces of myself again. I signed up for an art class, something I'd always wanted to do, but never had time for. I started going out for long walks, spending time with friends I hadn't seen in months, picking up books that had been gathering dust on my shelf. It felt strange, this freedom, this rediscovery of things I loved outside of us. But it also felt like healing, like I was beginning to remember who I was before we became us. There are still hard days, moments when the loneliness creeps in and I wonder if I made a mistake, if maybe we could have saved it if we just tried harder. I still catch myself thinking about him, missing the comfort of his presence, even if the love we once shared had faded. But little by little, I'm learning to live with the emptiness, to accept that sometimes endings are just the beginning of something new. Now, as I try to move forward, I'm left with this question. For anyone who's been through this, how did you let go of the life you thought you'd have? Did you find something meaningful on the other side of heartbreak? I'd really appreciate any advice, or maybe just knowing that I'm not alone in this journey. It all started with a gift, a simple gift that I thought would make him smile, something thoughtful and small. I'd spent hours choosing it, a leather-bound notebook with his initials engraved on the cover, perfect for his sketches and notes, something he'd mentioned needing. When I gave it to him, I felt this spark of excitement, waiting for him to open it, imagining the smile that would light up his face. But when he unwrapped it, he barely looked at me, just muttered, "Thanks," with this half-hearted tone, and set it aside without a second glance. He didn't even open it, didn't ask about the engraving, didn't notice the little details I'd chosen just for him. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself maybe he was tired or distracted, but the hurt lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't care, like I'd given him a piece of myself, and he just brushed it off. For days afterward, that moment replayed in my mind, and every time, it stung a little more. After that, I started noticing other things, small things that added up. I'd tell him about my day, something funny or exciting, and he'd barely react, just give me this absent, without even looking up. When we'd go out, I'd catch him checking his phone, scrolling through emails, or staring off into the distance, even when I was mid-sentence. I started feeling like I was talking to a ghost, like I was there but somehow invisible. One evening, I tried to bring it up. I started with something small, just mentioning how I missed our conversations, how I felt like he'd been somewhere else lately. He looked at me with this blank expression, almost like he didn't understand what I was saying. After a pause, he just shrugged and said, "I'm here, aren't I?" That sentence felt like a punch. I'm here, aren't I? Like that was enough, like simply existing beside me should satisfy whatever needs I had. I swallowed down the hurt and tried to explain it to him, saying, "I know you're here physically, but it feels like you're not really with me. I miss feeling like we're close." He sighed, sounding frustrated. "Not everything has to be intense. We're comfortable. Isn't that enough?" I was stunned. Comfortable? It felt anything, but I wanted to feel seen, to know he cared, to feel that warmth we used to share. But the way he looked at me, like I was making things complicated for no reason, made me wonder if I was asking too much. I nodded, letting the conversation drop. But inside, I could feel something crack, a small fracture I didn't know how to fix. Days turned into weeks, and things didn't improve. If anything, they got worse. Every time I tried to reach out, he'd respond with that same casual indifference, as if I were asking him to move mountains just by wanting a little of his attention. I started to feel like a burden, like I was asking for something unreasonable. I'd open my mouth to share something, then close it again, afraid of his size or his dismissive, "Oh, that's nice." Then one night, I hit a breaking point. We were watching a movie together, and there was this scene where the main character surprised his partner with a small, thoughtful gesture. Something silly but sweet. I watched, feeling this sharp ache, remembering when we used to have moments like that. I glanced over at him, hoping to see some reaction, but he was staring at his phone, scrolling, barely paying attention. I couldn't hold it in anymore. I paused the movie, took a deep breath, and said, "Do you even want to be here with me?" He looked up, clearly annoyed. "What's with the drama?" "I'm here, aren't I?" There it was again. "I'm here, aren't I?" He said it as if the bare minimum of physical presence was enough to sustain our relationship, as if I should be grateful for that alone. I felt a surge of frustration I could barely contain. "Just being here isn't the same as actually being with me," I said, my voice trembling. "I feel like I'm alone in this relationship." He rolled his eyes, the irritation on his face unmistakable. "You're always looking for problems that aren't there. Can't we just relax and watch a movie without dissecting everything?" His words cut deep. I wasn't looking for problems. I was desperate to feel connected, to feel like I mattered to him. I could feel the tears welling up, but I didn't want to let him see how much this was hurting me. I turned the movie back on and sat there, staring at the screen, but I couldn't focus. Inside, I felt like something precious was slipping away, something I couldn't hold on to no matter how hard I tried. In the days that followed, I pulled back, unsure how to even talk to him without feeling like I was being brushed off. Every conversation felt like I was walking on eggshells, careful to avoid anything that might trigger his irritation. I felt like I was shrinking, like I had to make myself smaller and smaller just to keep the peace. I tried to throw myself into other things, work, friends, hobbies, but the loneliness gnawed at me. I'd see other couples laughing together, sharing moments that felt natural and easy, and I'd feel this hollow ache. I wanted that back, that closeness we'd once had, but every time I tried to talk to him, it felt like I was hitting a wall. One night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of everything I hadn't said pressing down on me. I thought about the moments we used to share, the way he'd look at me with that soft smile, the way he'd make me feel like I was the only person in the room. But that version of him seemed like a distant memory now, replaced by this indifferent stranger beside me. I knew I couldn't keep going like this, so I decided to give it one last shot. I asked him if we could talk, and to his credit, he sat down, waiting for me to speak. My voice shook as I tried to explain how much his indifference was hurting me, how much I missed feeling connected, like we were a team. But he just sighed, looking more exasperated than understanding. "You're making this way bigger than it is," he said, his tone dismissive. "We're fine. Relationships settle down. You need to stop expecting things to be like they were in the beginning." I felt my heart drop. I wasn't asking for grand gestures or some fairy tale romance. I just wanted to feel seen, to feel like he still cared. But the look on his face made it clear. He didn't see the problem. To him, this was just how things were, and I was the one making it difficult by wanting more. Since that night, I've been struggling, wondering if I'm holding on to something that's already gone. I want to believe we can fix this, that there's still a way to find our way back to each other. But every time I try to reach him, he pulls further away, leaving me feeling lonelier than ever. So, I'm asking, has anyone been through this before? Is there a way to fix things when one person seems so detached? Or am I just holding on to a version of him that doesn't exist anymore? It was a Tuesday night, the kind where we'd usually just order takeout and unwind. I had a rough day at work, so I was looking forward to zoning out with Sarah and maybe just talking things over. When she got home, I started to tell her about a difficult meeting I'd had with my boss, trying to explain why I felt stressed and frustrated. Without looking up from her bag, she cut in, "Oh, you're not letting him get to you again, are you? Just ignore him. He's always been like that. No big deal, right? I stood there trying to laugh it off, but her words hit me the wrong way. I wanted to talk about it, to get things off my chest. Instead, I felt like I'd been brushed aside before I'd even started. Later that night, as we were eating dinner, I tried again. It's just hard, you know? This whole project's on me, and I feel like everyone's depending on me to make it work. She shrugged. So, do it your way. Don't worry about everyone else. Then she started talking about her own day, launching into details about an annoying client and a deadline she was stressed about. I sat there, feeling like I was fading out of my own conversation, like I was a passenger in a story I'd started. She barely looked up, but her words stayed with me, echoing that same message I'd been hearing for weeks now. Just handle it. Stop making a big deal out of things. I tried to brush it off. She had her own way of seeing things, I told myself. But that feeling lingered, this nagging sense that my thoughts, my feelings, didn't quite register with her. It wasn't a big argument, just a constant, quiet erosion of what I thought our relationship was. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing it more and more. I'd tell her about something personal, a memory from my childhood, a random story about a friend, and she'd cut in, interrupt, or change the subject. She'd correct little details, or she'd just nod and give a non-committal yet before moving on to her own stories. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was talking to a wall, that I was alone even when she was right next to me. One weekend, I decided to bring it up. I wanted to find a way to tell her how I'd been feeling, hoping that maybe she'd see things from my side. I said, "Hey, sometimes it feels like we're not really connecting. Like when I share things with you, you just move past them or change the subject." She looked at me like I'd just spoken a different language. "What? Are you saying I don't care about you?" "No, it's not that," I said, choosing my words carefully. "It's more that I feel like my thoughts or feelings don't seem important, I guess." She rolled her eyes. "Not everything has to be deep, you know. Can't we just have a simple conversation without you reading into things?" I felt this wave of frustration and sadness wash over me. It wasn't like I was asking for a therapy session. I just wanted a partner who would listen, who would be there for me the way I tried to be there for her. But her reaction made me feel like I was asking for something unreasonable, like I was just being too sensitive. After that, things started feeling strained. I stopped trying to open up, and when she'd ask how my day was, I'd just say fine or same old. I could tell she noticed. She'd give me these confused looks or ask if something was wrong. But every time I tried to tell her, I'd remember her dismissive words. I was tired of feeling like I had to defend my own emotions. Then came our anniversary. I'd planned a nice dinner, picked out a place I thought she'd love. I wanted it to be special, a chance to reconnect, to maybe bridge the gap that had been growing between us. As we sat down at the table, I reached out and held her hand, telling her how much she meant to me, how grateful I was to have her in my life. She smiled, but it was distant, polite. "Thank you," she said, pulling her hand back to check her phone for messages. I watched her, feeling a strange hollowness, like I was talking to someone who was already somewhere else. At some point during dinner, I mentioned that I'd been feeling a little disconnected, that I wanted us to talk more, to really be there for each other. I didn't even get to finish my sentence before she interrupted with, "Honestly, I think you just need to relax. You always make things so complicated." It was like I'd been hit with a brick. I couldn't believe that on a night meant to celebrate us, she could still find a way to brush off what I was feeling. I'd gone into that dinner with so much hope, thinking maybe this time things would be different. But sitting there, watching her scroll through her phone, I realized I was more alone in that moment than I'd ever been. After that night, something shifted in me. I started questioning everything. What we had, what I wanted, whether this was the kind of relationship that could really last. I'd always thought that love was enough, that as long as we cared about each other, everything else would work itself out. But now I wasn't so sure. A few days later, I decided to try one last time to get through to her. I asked if we could have a serious talk, if she could put her phone down and just listen. I told her everything. How I felt dismissed, how I felt like I couldn't really share anything with her, how much I wanted us to understand each other. She listened, but there was this bored look in her eyes that just broke my heart. When I finally finished, she let out a long sigh and said, "I don't know what you want me to say. It just sounds like you're always unhappy, no matter what I do." It hit me like a punch. Here I was pouring my heart out, and she made it sound like I was just being difficult, like my feelings were a burden she didn't want to carry. I sat there, stunned. In that moment, I realized something painful but true. We were never going to be on the same page. I was always going to feel like I was reaching out to someone who wasn't willing to reach back. I wanted depth, connection, someone who could understand me and share in my struggles. But for her, my needs were just too much. Since that talk, I've been wrestling with the idea of what to do next. Part of me wants to keep trying, hoping that maybe she'll understand one day. But another part of me wonders if I'm just clinging to an idea of who I wish she could be, instead of seeing who she really is. So, here I am, asking the community for advice. Has anyone else felt this kind of disconnect with someone they love? Is there any way to bridge a gap when it feels like your partner just can't or won't meet you halfway? Or is it better to accept that sometimes love isn't enough if you're not really being seen? The day I met Mia, I was late to my cousin's engagement party, totally frazzled, and had just spilled coffee down the front of my shirt. As I darted in, there she was, laughing at some joke she just told, lighting up the whole room. She had this kind of low, easygoing vibe that made everyone lean in closer. When we finally got introduced, she gave me this warm smile and said, "Rough morning." That was Mia, disarming, kind, instantly comfortable. We ended up talking most of the night, and I couldn't believe how effortlessly we clicked. She was thoughtful and hilarious, asking about my life and actually caring about the answers. She had dreams about traveling, wanted to adopt a dog, and was the first person I'd met who loved diving into old jazz records as much as I did. She even invited me to join her and her friends for brunch that weekend. Right away, I was struck by how real she was, how she was totally herself with everyone around her. Mia wasn't about putting on a show, and she didn't feel the need to dress up her life. She was exactly what I'd been looking for without knowing it. Green flags everywhere. Confident but humble. Caring but independent. Spontaneous yet solid. In the first few months, I felt like I was walking on air. She was attentive without being clingy, constantly surprising me with little things like a new album she thought I'd like or a postcard from a place she wanted us to visit one day. She'd show up with takeout after a long day, throw on some music, and we'd talk for hours like we'd known each other forever. My friends and family loved her too. My sister even said, "You two are like a rom-com that actually works." But then little things started to happen, subtle moments that made me pause. One night, I mentioned I was meeting an old friend from college for drinks, a friend Mia had met before. She got quiet and asked, "Is she single?" I laughed it off, saying yes, she was single but had a boyfriend back home, and it was just a catch-up. Mia didn't say anything more, but her silence felt heavy, like there was something else she wanted to say. Later, when I asked if everything was okay, she just smiled and said, "I trust you." And she sounded like she meant it, but the look in her eyes felt like a question I couldn't answer. A few days later, I was out with my friend Jake, catching a late movie after work. Mia texted me a couple of times asking what we were watching, how late I'd be out, and then just checking that I got home okay. It was sweet, really. I thought she was just being considerate, especially since it was a late night. But these little check-ins started becoming more common. She'd text whenever I was out with friends, always in this casual, just curious way, asking what we were up to, who I was with when I thought I'd be back. At first, I told myself it was cute, that she was just looking out for me. But after a while, I started noticing a pattern. If I didn't respond fast enough or stayed out longer than planned, she'd go quiet. The next day, she'd be distant, a little withdrawn, like she was waiting for me to notice something was wrong. When I'd ask if everything was okay, she'd sigh and say, "I just miss you sometimes, that's all. I know you have your life, but I'm just here waiting." It always felt so subtle, like she wasn't accusing me of anything, but just gently reminding me she was there, waiting, like I should feel guilty for not always being around. One night, we went out with some of her friends, and things took an even stranger turn. I was chatting with one of her old college buddies, and Mia walked over, casually slipping her arm through mine. I didn't think much of it, but later, she told me she felt left out and didn't like when I bonded too much with her friends. I reassured her, told her that she was my priority, that I was just getting to know her people. She smiled and said she understood, but I could feel a hint of doubt lingering in the air between us. It was such a subtle shift, but it started coloring everything. If I didn't invite her to something, she'd go quiet and say she felt like she was missing out on my life. If I made plans with friends without asking her first, she'd act hurt, like I hadn't considered her feelings. She didn't ask me to stop seeing them or outright demand anything. She was far too gentle for that. Instead, she just let me know that she felt a little lonely when I was out, that she missed me, that it was so hard to be apart. I started adjusting my schedule without even realizing it, inviting her to more things, checking in with her before making plans, anything to avoid that quiet disappointment. One night, my sister invited me over for dinner, just the two of us. I told Mia about it, thinking she'd understand, but her face fell. "I just thought you'd want me there with you," she said, her voice soft but unmistakably hurt. I felt torn. How could I possibly make her feel left out over a casual dinner with my sister? But I tried to reassure her, told her we'd hang out afterward, but she just gave me this sad little smile and said, "It's okay. Have fun." When I got back, she was quiet, curled up on the couch, and didn't say much. After a while, she finally whispered, "Sometimes it feels like I'm on the outside of your life." That comment hit me hard. I didn't want her to feel that way, and I started to wonder if maybe I wasn't doing enough to show her how much she meant to me. The final straw came at a mutual friend's birthday party. I'd stepped outside for a bit to chat with a friend I hadn't seen in ages. We ended up talking for a while, catching up on life. When I came back inside, Mia was standing off to the side, watching me. Her face was blank, but her eyes were cold. I walked over, and she barely looked at me, finally saying, "Did you forget about me?" It wasn't playful or teasing. It felt like an accusation. I was taken aback and tried to explain that I'd just been catching up, but she shook her head and said, "It's like I don't even exist when other people are around." We argued quietly in the corner, her voice low and strained as she told me she didn't know how to handle feeling so unseen. For the first time, I pushed back, saying that I needed space, that I couldn't always be on for her. She looked at me, hurt and frustrated, saying, "I just want to be a part of your life. Why is that so hard?" I realized then that what had started as attention and care had turned into a kind of emotional weight I was constantly carrying, trying to keep her happy, to make sure she never felt left out or unloved. A few days later, we sat down, and I told her we needed some space. I said that her constant need for reassurance was making me feel trapped, like I was losing pieces of myself trying to keep her close. She cried, saying she'd never meant to make me feel that way, that she just loved me so much it scared her sometimes. It was heartbreaking, but I knew I couldn't keep bending myself into something I wasn't just to ease her insecurities. Ending things was harder than I thought. She reached out a few times afterward, saying she missed me and that she wished she'd done things differently. And even though I cared about her, I realized I'd spent most of our relationship trying to manage her feelings rather than sharing my life with her. Looking back, I wonder, how do you tell the difference between someone's love and someone's need? How can you spot the moment when green flags, affection, attentiveness, wanting to be close, become red flags, slowly trapping you without you even noticing? So, Reddit, how do you know when love starts to smother instead of support? And when you feel like you're losing pieces of yourself, how do you find the strength to let go? When I first met Jamie, it was like meeting someone who understood me in ways I didn't even understand myself. We both ended up at a mutual friend's party, and within minutes of talking, it felt like we'd known each other for years. He was smart, funny, and shared my weird love of 80s horror movies, which, to me, felt like the universe was sending a sign. That night, he walked me home, and when he pulled me into a tight, warm hug before I went inside, I felt this unexplainable comfort, like I'd found someone I could finally be myself with. Jamie was the kind of guy who didn't just talk about caring for people. He showed it. He'd call me every morning just to ask how I'd slept, would text me little things throughout the day that made me laugh or smile. He seemed genuinely interested in everything about me, from the books I read to the tiniest quirks I didn't think anyone would notice. I'd never had anyone pay attention to me like that before. He felt like the green flag I'd always been looking for, someone who truly understood me. At first, he seemed to make my life bigger. He was always bringing new ideas, new places, and new experiences into my life. He convinced me to join a rock climbing gym with him, something I'd been too nervous to try on my own. He would cheer me on, always saying how proud he was, how he loved seeing me push myself. When I mentioned my dream of traveling to Iceland someday, he immediately started planning a trip for us. He had this adventurous spirit that made me feel like I was stepping into a new, bolder version of myself. And I was all in, but almost like a shadow creeping in, little things started to feel off. It was subtle at first. If I mentioned plans with friends, he'd seem disappointed, saying, "I just thought we'd spend more time together." Or he'd say, "I feel like you're my best friend," as if he wanted me to feel the same way and choose him over everyone else. I told myself it was just because he cared so much, but a small part of me felt guilty every time I had to tell him no. Then came the night of my friend Rachel's birthday. Rachel and I had been close for years, and she'd planned a big night out for a group of us. When I mentioned it to Jamie, he went quiet, nodding but looking down at his phone. When I asked if he was okay, he sighed and said, "I just don't get why you want to go out with them when you could spend time here, just us." His words left me feeling torn. I hadn't even realized that the expectation was to spend every weekend together. When I finally went out with Rachel, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling of guilt. Every time I checked my phone, there was a new text from Jamie. "Hope you're having fun," followed by, "Miss you," and later, "Are you heading home soon?" By the end of the night, I felt like I was disappointing him, like I'd done something wrong just by having plans that didn't involve him. Over the next few weeks, he started showing up at my apartment more often, always by surprise, always with a warm smile that made me feel like I was special. If I had plans, he'd find a way to swing by before I left, saying he just wanted to see me. Part of me felt flattered, even happy to be with someone who cared so much. But another part of me started to feel crowded. It was like he'd quietly placed himself in every corner of my life, and soon, I didn't know where I ended and he began. One night, I had a work event that I couldn't miss. Jamie knew about it, but when the night came, he called and said he'd had a bad day and wanted to see me. I told him I'd be there as soon as I could, and he said he understood, but I could tell he wasn't happy. Throughout the evening, I kept checking my phone, nervous that he'd be upset. By the time I left the event and got to his place, he looked at me with this sad expression and said, "You always choose work over me." I felt my stomach drop. I hadn't chosen anything. I just done what I needed to do. But he kept bringing it up, saying he just felt unimportant, like he'd always come second to everything else. I spent the entire night reassuring him, feeling like I was trying to earn back some approval I hadn't realized I'd lost. From that night on, it became a pattern. If I had plans, he'd ask subtle questions. "Are you sure you don't want to do something? Just us?" If I didn't text him back quickly enough, he'd make a small comment about how everyone else must be more important. I'd started changing things without even realizing it, cutting time with friends short, skipping work events, and even rescheduling family visits just to keep him happy. The pivotal moment came when I went to visit my parents one weekend. It was a trip I'd planned for months, but the night before I left, Jamie called, sounding distant. He said he was feeling down and really needed me. When I told him I couldn't cancel my plans, he didn't argue. Instead, he just said, "I'll be fine, I guess. I'll just miss you." The guilt weighed on me the whole weekend. I found myself checking my phone constantly, wondering if he was okay, apologizing for not being there. For the first time, my visit with my family felt like an obligation I couldn't fully commit to. When I got back, he acted like nothing had happened, like I hadn't just spent the entire weekend feeling guilty for spending time with my own family. That was when I started noticing the pattern. He didn't explicitly ask me to give up things. I just felt compelled to, like it was something I should do to make him happy. The real breaking point came one afternoon when a college friend was in town. We met for coffee, and when I checked my phone after our chat, there were 6 missed calls and several messages from Jamie, all with increasing urgency. "Where are you? Is everything okay? Why aren't you answering?" When I called him back, he sounded panicked. "I thought something had happened to you," he said almost accusingly. I tried to explain that I'd just lost track of time, but he cut me off, saying, "How can you not understand how worried I was?" I felt like I'd done something terrible, like I'd hurt him by simply existing in a world outside of him. He kept going, saying he'd been pacing the floor and imagining the worst. That night, lying in bed, I felt exhausted. Not just physically, but emotionally, like my life had slowly narrowed down to the small, Jamie-centered world he'd built around me. The freedom I'd once felt with him, the way he made me feel alive, had somehow turned into a form of captivity. I finally realized I had to break things off, but when I told him, he was devastated. He cried, saying he didn't understand, that he only wanted to love me, to be close to me. He swore he'd change, that he'd do better. For a moment, I doubted myself, feeling that familiar guilt, that sense of obligation to make him happy. But I knew if I stayed, I'd lose myself completely. Now, months later, I look back and wonder how I didn't see the red flags and all those green flags. How his intense attention was really just a need to control, to make me fit into his world while shrinking my own. So here I am, asking anyone who's been in a similar situation, how do you know when love is actually control? And when the lines are so blurred, how can you tell when you're slowly losing yourself? I never thought I'd be the one to turn to strangers on the internet for relationship advice. But here I am. I can't tell if I'm overthinking things, or if I'm watching my relationship slowly slip away and don't know how to stop it. For a bit of background, we've been together for 3 years. It was one of those love at first sight situations, at least for me. We clicked immediately, and it felt like we could do anything together. We were that couple, the one that finishes each other's sentences, that friends tease because we still hold hands and act like we're in the honeymoon phase. But now, looking at him, it feels like I'm looking at a stranger who's borrowed his face. It started with the smallest things. I didn't even notice it at first. Just felt like something was off, like some undercurrent that was hard to pin down. For one, we used to stay up talking until one of us would fall asleep mid-sentence. But lately, our conversations feel strange short. I ask him questions about his day, about his family, but his answers are just surface level, like he's ticking boxes. Last week, he didn't even laugh at a joke I made, a joke he would have cracked up at before. He just smiled absently and looked back at his phone. I keep telling myself it's nothing, that he's probably just stressed. He's had a lot on his plate at work, and I know he's dealing with some stuff in his family. But I also know him, or at least I thought I did. He's always been the one to open up, to talk about things rather than bottling them up. But now he just shrugs it off with, "It's nothing, don't worry," or "It's just work." Then, last Thursday, we went to a friend's birthday party. It should have been fun, but I felt like I was there by myself. He was quiet, hardly talking to anyone, even though these are friends we've known for years. I nudged him a couple of times, asking if he was okay, and each time he'd just say, "Yeah, I'm fine," and give me this reassuring smile that didn't reach his eyes. I kept catching him checking his phone, like he was somewhere else entirely. When we got home, I wanted to bring it up. I felt this need to ask him what was going on, to find out why he seemed so far away. But before I could say anything, he was already in bed, lying on his side, facing away from me. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, wondering what had changed and if he even noticed it. It felt like I was the only one feeling this distance, and that made it even worse. The thing is, he's still sweet sometimes, and that's what's messing with my head. Last weekend, he brought me flowers, my favorite lilies, just because he'd said with this little smile. And for a moment, I felt like everything was okay, like maybe I'd been imagining all of it. But then, that night, he turned in early, mumbling something about being tired. And there I was, left with those beautiful flowers that suddenly felt like they'd been given to someone else. I know it's irrational, but I felt this weird pang of sadness, like I was grasping at something that was slipping right through my fingers. And it's not like he's checked out completely. Sometimes he'll do things that make me feel like he's still all in, like when he surprised me with reservations at our favorite restaurant last month. It was perfect. He even ordered my favorite dessert before I'd had a chance to. But when I looked at him across the table, it was like he wasn't really there. I watched him, wondering if he noticed I was noticing him pull away. I felt like a stranger at our own table, smiling and making small talk, pretending I didn't feel this awful, gnawing distance between us. Part of me feels like I'm just going crazy, like I'm projecting my own fears onto him. But then I think back to the way things were, and I can't shake the feeling that something's changed. We used to talk about our future, where we want to travel next, the things we wanted to do together, little dreams we had for the life we wanted to build. But now, whenever I bring up anything remotely about us, he just nods or says, "Yeah, that sounds nice." He used to be the one making plans, talking about our next steps. Now he's just there, agreeable, but with none of the passion he once had. The worst part is, I can't even tell if it's something I've done. I keep replaying things in my head, trying to figure out if I missed a moment, said something wrong, or if he's pulling away for some reason he's not telling me. I don't know how many times I've started to ask him outright if there's something going on, but every time, I stop myself. What if it's all in my head? What if I'm overthinking things, and I end up pushing him away by being needy? But last night, I reached my breaking point. We were sitting on the couch, watching a movie we'd both been excited to see, and halfway through, I realized he was barely watching. He kept glancing at his phone, texting someone, then shifting in his seat, acting like he was bored out of his mind. When the movie ended, he just got up and said, "I think I'm going to turn in early. I'm exhausted." And he left, leaving me there with this pit in my stomach. I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about every little thing, every smile he'd given me that seemed just a little too polite, every night he'd turn away from me in bed. Finally, around 2 a.m., I went into the bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed, and blurted out, "What's going on with us?" He looked up, and I could see this flash of surprise, maybe even guilt in his eyes. He sat up, rubbing his face, and sighed. "I don't know," he said after a long pause. "I'm just dealing with some things right now. It's not about you, really. I need some time." I didn't know what to say. Time for what? I wanted to scream. What do you mean, dealing with things? But I couldn't get the words out. Instead, I just nodded, feeling like someone had knocked the air out of me. He gave me this sad, tired smile, like he wished he could say more but wouldn't. I stayed there for a few minutes, sitting in silence beside him, until he finally laid back down and turned away, leaving me there, feeling like I'd just asked a stranger about my own relationship. So now, here I am, asking strangers what to do because I have no idea how to move forward. How do you tell if this is just a phase or if he's already started slipping away? How do you even know if someone's still in love with you when they keep saying all the right things but nothing feels the same? If anyone's been through this, if anyone's been where I am, caught in this horrible, uncertain place, please tell me how you figured it out. Because right now, I feel like I'm holding on to the shadow of a person who's already gone, and I don't know how to let go. The night I met Liam, it felt like fate. I was at a concert with a friend, one of those rare evenings where everything felt right. The music, the atmosphere, even the random strangers dancing around us. Liam was there with a few friends of his own, and he ended up next to me when the crowd surged forward. We got to talking during a break, and he had this easy, effortless charm that instantly drew me in. He was funny, quick-witted, and when he looked at me, it felt like he saw right through the surface. By the end of the night, I felt like I'd known him for years. From that point on, we were inseparable. Liam had this knack for making every moment feel like an adventure, even the small, everyday things. He'd show up outside my work just to take me out for lunch or leave surprise notes on my car. The way he pursued me, so intensely and so wholeheartedly, made me feel like I was special in a way I'd never felt before. Friends started saying how lucky I was, how they'd never seen me so happy, and I'd just smile, secretly thrilled that I'd found someone who seemed so perfect. It wasn't until a few months in that I started noticing the cracks. We were out to dinner one night, and I bumped into an old friend from college. We talked for just a few minutes, catching up quickly, and when I got back to the table, Liam's expression had changed. He looked at me, his eyes narrowed, and asked, "Who was that?" I explained, laughing it off, but he wasn't smiling. He barely said a word the rest of the night, and on the drive home, he muttered, "I didn't realize you were still so close to other guys." His words stung, and I found myself apologizing even though I hadn't done anything wrong. But I brushed it off, thinking maybe he was just protective. Maybe it was just a passing insecurity. But after that night, his need to know everything about me grew. He'd ask detailed questions about who I was texting, where I was going, and who I'd be with. I told myself it was endearing, that he just cared about me and wanted to feel close. When I'd bring it up, he'd say, "I'm just looking out for you. I only want to make sure you're safe." It sounded reasonable enough, so I didn't push back. I told myself I was overthinking it, that his protectiveness was just another form of love. But his control over my life crept in slowly, like water filling a room, and by the time I noticed, I was already in too deep. It started with little things, like him suggesting I stop hanging out with certain friends who he thought were bad influences. He'd say things like, "I just don't trust their motives. They don't care about you the way I do." Over time, I started turning down invites, making excuses to avoid any arguments. Eventually, my friends stopped inviting me altogether. Then he began commenting on my family, making offhand remarks about how they didn't really support me. He'd say things like, "Your mom's nice, but have you noticed how she always undermines you?" Or, "Your sister just seems jealous. She doesn't want you to be happy." At first, I laughed it off, but he kept planting these seeds of doubt. And after a while, I found myself pulling back from my family to slowly drifting into a world where Liam was the only person I felt close to. One night, my best friend from high school was having a birthday party, and I planned to go. I hadn't seen her in months, and I was excited to catch up. When I told Liam, he looked at me with this cold, hurt expression and said, "I thought we were going to spend the weekend together. I guess you'd rather be with your friends." I felt the guilt creeping in, and before I knew it, I was canceling my plans, sending her a vague excuse about being too busy. I felt horrible, but Liam's relief was so tangible that I convinced myself it was the right choice. The worst part was how he could twist anything into an act of betrayal. If I didn't answer his text right away, he'd say, "It's like you don't even care about me." If I mentioned something good that happened at work, he'd get this distant look saying, "I just wish I was as important to you as your job." The guilt was relentless, and every time, I'd bend myself a little further to avoid disappointing him. I started questioning my own instincts, wondering if maybe I was really the problem, if maybe I was too distant or not as loving as he needed. Then came the control over my appearance. Liam would make subtle remarks about my clothes, saying certain outfits were too much or not really my style. He'd insist I look better with less makeup, that I didn't need all that. It started innocently enough, but over time, I found myself changing the way I dressed, trying to fit the image he wanted. I barely noticed it at first, until one day I looked in the mirror and realized I didn't even recognize myself. I'd become this muted version of who I used to be, always second-guessing, always trying to keep him happy. One day, I finally mustered the courage to bring up how I was feeling. I told him I felt like I'd lost touch with my friends, that I missed spending time with family. His reaction was immediate and explosive. He told me I was being dramatic, that he was the only one who truly cared for me, that everyone else was just using me or didn't really understand me. He twisted it all back on me, making it seem like I was ungrateful for his love, that I didn't appreciate all he'd done to protect me. I found myself apologizing, feeling like maybe I'd overstepped, that maybe he was right, and I was just being selfish. The isolation grew deeper, until Liam was my whole world. I'd quit the hobbies I loved, barely saw my family, and had stopped talking to most of my friends. Every decision, every choice had to be run by him first to avoid an argument or a silent treatment that would leave me feeling anxious for days. My life felt like it was wrapped in this tight, suffocating circle, with Liam at the center dictating every move. The breaking point came one night when I received a message from an old friend, someone who'd heard through the grapevine that I wasn't really around anymore. She asked if I was okay, saying she was worried because it seemed like I'd disappeared. For the first time, I looked around at my life, at the pieces of myself I'd slowly lost to keep Liam happy, and I realized how deeply I'd isolated myself. He'd become my entire world, but it was a world that felt small, dark, and lonely. When I told Liam I wanted a break to figure things out, his reaction was immediate and terrifying. He got furious, saying, "After all I've done for you, you'd throw me away like this?" He told me I'd be nothing without him, that I'd go back to the miserable person I was before we met. And in that moment, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time: anger. I realized that his love had never been love. It had been control, manipulation, a way to make me believe I couldn't survive without him. Leaving wasn't easy. He called me constantly, showing up at my place, begging, threatening, promising he'd change. He'd go from blaming me to saying he was sorry, that he was just scared to lose me. But I'd finally woken up, and I knew that going back would mean losing myself completely. Now I'm trying to rebuild. It's strange to see friends again, to go out without feeling like I'm doing something wrong. I'm rediscovering pieces of myself I'd buried to keep him happy, learning to trust my own decisions again. But I still feel the shadows of his words sometimes, still question if I'm allowed to want the life I once had. To anyone who's felt like they were trapped in someone else's version of love, how did you find yourself again? How did you start over after giving so much of yourself to someone who only wanted control?